Hello and welcome to the Modern Dandy. Today I want to answer the question of, is poetry right for you? Poetry is an ancient art form that's lasted for many years, for hundreds, thousands of years. It's one of the oldest art forms known to man, especially considering how recent electricity has been. Poetry is a very special kind of art form. It's written in lyric, it's written in verse, but it's not a song. It often comes in meters, with rhymes, and although freeform is a common and popular form of poetry, at least for me, nothing quite matches a very metered and lyrical, versed rhyming poem. So, is poetry right for you? So there are numerous really good things about poetry for you to consider. One thing is that it's a writing exercise. Writing exercises, especially creative writing, are definitely often recommended by experts. They are something that many people think is helpful for your brain, and that getting that right brain engaged is very important in life, especially when we live in such a left brain type of world. At least most of us do. So it also helps you vent your emotions, being able to express the pain you're going through. If you're going through sorrow, or if you're going through serious depression, or if you're happy, if you're joyful, if you're embarrassed, if you're angry, all of these things can really be sorted through if you put them onto page and really express them in the form of poetry. Another thing that's really good about poetry is it helps you express your thoughts. If you're thinking through things, if you have certain things, certain philosophies, all these sort of things that you're kind of thinking on but can't quite get onto paper, poetry can help you with that. It can help you organize your mind. Now, there's a lot of us that can have very disorganized minds. We can really struggle, especially me. I have ADHD. So, poetry, when you're writing all of these thoughts you have, when you're putting them down, it can really help organize yourself. One good thing is you can do calligraphy. Calligraphy is another very ancient art form, and being able to write on pages with calligraphy and do poetry on it is a very special kind of thing to do, and I would really recommend trying it at least once. One great thing about poetry is you can talk about your passions. If you are very passionate about philosophy, if you're very passionate about pretty much anything, even cooking or science, you can write about these in poetry, and you can really present these ideas in a very interesting and engaging way. You get to share your work. When you write poetry, you can share it with people. You can get their feedback. You can improve as a poet. This is something really cool. It's very fun to see people really engaged with your poem, really read it and tell you about it. It's very fun. You get to touch other people when you write poetry. This is something that's a very valuable thing. When you are able to touch someone's life just through something you've written, even if it just took 20 minutes to write, there is something very touching to both parties about that. And the one other great thing about poetry is it's short. You're not going to have to commit to writing a novel or a novella, even a short story. Poetry can take even 15 minutes to write one poem, so it's very quick and easy to do. Alright, now, what are the bad things about poetry? I really could only come up with one. There are very few, I think, bad things about poetry. When you get into it, I can't really think of anything the average person would really find very unpleasant about poetry. However, it's very hard to make money on. If you plan on making a living as a poet, you're going to have to be very good, work a lot. It's going to be an absolute pain. So I really do not recommend taking up poetry as an occupation. Now, I wanted to talk about different ways you can apply poetry to your life outside of just writing it alone to yourself. Well, for one thing, the obvious thing is love poems. These are very common kinds of poetry, and if you have a partner, being able to write poetry for them is a very nice and very pleasant thing to do. It can really increase your connection. Love poems are a great way to connect with your lover. Another great thing is limericks. Limericks are very short humorous poems. You'll have to learn exactly how they're done because they're usually done in iambic and they're usually done in a certain number of syllables per line. However, they are very fun poems. They can often be dirty, and if that's not your humor, you don't have to do it, so I wouldn't really recommend sharing those kind of limericks with the average person, but with close friends, that can always be a good time. And lastly, you can give poems as gifts. I gave a poem to a cousin of mine, a young cousin. He's a child, and he really enjoyed it. I was able to really make a humorous, fun poem for him. I called it a ballad. And if you can write these sort of fun, light poems for people, you can give them as gifts. There's something very personal and touching about that. It's really a nice way to connect, especially if you don't have the money to spend on a gift. Because writing a poem will only take about 10 to 15 minutes, and you can make it very personal. Just be sure to put in a good amount of effort into it. So next I want to answer the question of, is poetry dead? Well, we all know poets of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries: Shakespeare, Lord Byron, Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson. All of these poets are very famous, and we don't really have any poets like that today. And I do think that is for a reason. With the rise of technology, with the rise of electricity, we now have movies, we now have TV shows, we now have music that's easily accessible, and poetry has kind of fallen to the wayside. Definitely not as much as books, but even then, novel writing isn't as lucrative as it might have been 100 years ago. So, as for if poetry is dead, well, I don't really think so. I think that poetry does still hold a place in a very personal way, in a way of expressing yourself, in a way of writing. However, as a business and as a mass form of entertainment, I would say yes, poetry is dead. And that may not stay the case. Maybe poetry will have a revival, and maybe we'll see more and more famous poets. But for now, poetry is no longer a feasible way of making a living. It's not a feasible way of touching millions of people. And really, you're going to need to be very passionate, very good, very lucky to actually make even a small living off of poetry, or you just need to do it as a hobby. So in conclusion, I think that poetry is a very valuable skill to have. It's not something you can really make your living off of, if you ask me, although some people definitely can make their living off of it as a teacher, but that's going to be very hard to find. So really you're going to do best pursuing other careers. However, there's something very therapeutic about poetry. Many people have talked about poetry being very therapeutic, very relaxing, very calming. There's just something wonderful about writing your thoughts, your feelings onto a page in something that really sounds very beautiful. And there's lots of forms of poetry. There's all sorts of things like limericks, which can be very fun. You can write very light verse. You can write very heavy things. You can write very long, short. You can write haikus. There are all sorts of poetry that you can do, and I'm sure you'll find one that suits you. So, this is the Modern Dandy, and thank you for watching.